This is the year 1944. The free men of the world are marching together to victory.
The length and breadth of the country, it was the same story. Almost overnight, the fields were deserted where the camps had been. The men and machines of war had left, in convoys of trucks and trains.
And then just one morning, we got up to go to school, junior school. Nothing, gone.
Leaving behind the assembly areas to join ships and aircraft, casting off and taking off over the English Channel to the beaches of Normandy.
Gigantic procession of men, tanks, trucks, guns, and engines of war, terrible to behold, rumbled unceasingly on the road to the ships and to victory.
After rattling along here in the 1940s half-track, we're going down the same road that the American troops took from Broadmain down to Weymouth. Mile after mile of convoy, going through these narrow lanes. Thousands and thousands of these young men made places like Broadmain their home. They lived here for 2 or 3 years. This road was the start of a long journey for a lot of them, or a very short journey for most of them. At least 2,000 approximately died on D-Day on Omaha Beach alone.
We marvel at the skill of those whose duty it was to marshal and embark so vast an undertaking.
The ground troops in their landing craft and troop ships cast off their lines, formed up in convoys, and joined the largest armada the world has ever seen, bound for the far shore.
We left the marshalling area with full battle equipment, about 100 pounds per man. The harbor of Weymouth was crowded with ships of every size, shape, and description, most of them flying the Stars and Stripes. We would hit the beach the next morning at 6:30 a.m. June 6, 1944.
One of the assembly points and airfields for the 101st Airborne was at Up Ottery near Exeter.
The very spot where some of the first men and machines took off for the invasion of Europe. 75 years ago, I would have been standing here looking out at an airfield crammed full of C-47s taken off into the night for the invasion of Normandy.
British and American paratroopers and glider-borne troops assembled, ready to drop from the night skies into Normandy and secure the western and eastern flanks of the invasion area. Around 10 p.m. on the night of June the 5th, the C-47s of the American, British and Canadian airborne divisions began loading their paratroopers, and around midnight taking off as part of the airborne element of the Great Crusade. The price of freedom for future generations was about to be paid, as hundreds of thousands answered the call to Normandy.
So loaded down with equipment. Every man had at least one anti-tank mine.
Around 0001 hours, June 6th, I heard the roar of aircraft. I got up and looked out into the sky, and I noticed airplanes and gliders behind them. The 101st, 82nd Airborne were being flown to drop non-stop.
The mighty air armada of Allied bombers, transport planes and gliders took to the air above the south coast and flew in an endless stream to Normandy. On the 75th anniversary of D-Day, our Normandy invasion had an almost carnival atmosphere as we boarded the ferry from Portsmouth. Taxis from London brought many British veterans on board, with Canadians and Americans too. They were old men and women, accompanied by family, nurses and friends, but they still had a glint in their eye. The accompaniment of wartime launches, gunboats, a fire tug, the Dunkirk flotilla and a Royal Navy destroyer provided a fitting escort as we edged out of the Solent from exactly the same port that 75 years ago was the last view of home for so many British, Canadian and American servicemen. And as the seas mounted and our escort turned back, we headed into the English Channel, bound once again for Normandy. The ageing veterans who had seen so much and done so much were now very frail, yet rallied to the skirl of the pipes in a small ceremony for lost comrades.
They shall not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. The going down of the sun, and in the morning we will remember them. We will remember them. Piper!
Because 5 years ago I was here in Normandy for the 70th anniversary, and there were a reasonable number of veterans there, but there was this sense that this was a generation slipping away, and you know, they were treated like rock stars, and quite rightly so.
D-Day!
Fortunately, so many of them have left testimonies behind. There are archives stuffed full of diaries and letters. So those words, those voices, that human experience of war, which is so incredibly compelling, will still be there.
We spent time chatting to them, and although many were keen to talk, others seemed overwhelmed by the media attention.
I can get emotional. Never spoke about it for all the years after I didn't after the war. I didn't return until about nearly 70 years later. There are no roses on sailors' graves, nor wreaths upon the storm-tossed waves. Pat Thomas.
Ted Fitzgerald. Thank you very much, Pat. Ted Fitzgerald.
Several of these British veterans were paratroopers, and some had jumped into Normandy in the early hours of D-Day to take the bridges over the River Orne near Caen and secure the eastern flank of the invasion area. As with the Americans on the western flank, this was conducted at night, and an absolute necessity to the success of the whole operation. The bridge over the canal near Caen, now called Pegasus Bridge, was the first objective taken in the early hours of D-Day. This action halted the German panzers on the eastern flank.
Troops of the British 6th Airborne Division are charged with securing bridges over the Dives and Orne rivers. In addition, they are to silence a massive German battery near Merville that is zeroed in on the far eastern invasion beach. In a daring maneuver, the Brits in Horsa gliders land mere yards from a crucial bridge over the Orne. The Germans, caught completely off guard, are quickly routed.
Made of wood, plywood if I'm correct, which could carry a jeep and a trailer, or a jeep and a gun. One of the pilots remarked they preferred the Horsa glider because of the flying skills.
You could cut up the tail part, and you got two ramps on the glider. You put them out and you can drive the jeep out of the glider.
Basically a controlled crash when it came into land.
Go, releasing now!
It would rattle along on the skids.
It's really brave to fly in those gliders.
The front of the aircraft offered no protection whatsoever.
Brace yourself for landing!
Plexiglass, plywood and linen. You could
push your finger through it if you tried really hard. The men who flew these are some of the unsung heroes of this operation. If the glider pilots survived, they fought alongside their comrades as infantry.
A small cafe near the bridge is set up as a field hospital, and the troops brace themselves for a counterattack. Near Merville, things don't go as easily. Upon landing, the battalion designated to silence the battery is shattered, reduced from 700 to merely 150 men. The survivors know that if they don't knock out the battery, the landings will be cut to pieces. Fighting overwhelming odds and lacking proper equipment, they attack. Casualties are horrendous as the men fight their way through the German defenses. But within an hour, they have claimed their costly prize.
We met up with one of the Brit para guys who had survived the battle. We talked over a beer at the first building to be liberated in France, the Café of Madame Gironde.
Varaville, I think it was, dropping zone. But our pilots got deflected. Somebody was potting at them, I believe. So they dropped half of the fellas in the Dive, in the floodwaters, and the remainder of us on the land beyond it, you know.
It wasn't just the taking of the bridge, it was holding this area against the 15th Panzer Division.
The hope was that we would have sorted it all out before the boats came in. It got a bit difficult.
If the German army had managed to get across those bridges, they would have swept through into the British beaches as the troops were landing. And with the armour, they'd probably have rolled up Gold, Juno and Sword.
Yeah, and I got wounded and I became prisoner of war eventually.
Because they simply ran out of bullets and food. Their job here was vital, and they did it with the most meagre of weapons.
There was not enough of us, too many of them, and we had nothing to fight with. They had everything, and so they put us in the bag.
Many of the British soldiers who fought here around Pegasus Bridge and in the neighbouring swamp area were buried where they fell. In the local churchyard, there are many here. All seem to have died at the same time on June the 6th, which gives an idea of the intensity of the fighting. In another part of the Ranville graveyard, there was a small ceremony being conducted by Jewish historian and journalist Mark Garant. Mark is an ex-Israeli Special Forces soldier, here dressed in British paratrooper uniform of the time and taking part in the many drops reenacted in the area.
My father's parents were killed in Holocaust. My father was in France, they were all in France, and my grandmother was shipped to Auschwitz and gassed there. And my grandfather and one of my uncles were shot by the Germans as a reprisal.
He related the fascinating story behind the headstone.
When Private Peter Claude Denby-Dreyfus leapt out of his C-47 Dakota troop transport aircraft into the dark, dangerous, flak-torn night, he did not really know what awaited him at the end of his short parachute drop to the ground, that many of the paratroops would be without support weapons and radios. With him, some 4,200 other British paratroops were jumping into the night, possessed with the same uncertainty, heading for the same place, some for the same fate. And about 50 miles to the west at about the same time, some 13,100 American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would begin the exact same adventure. Peter had no time for such fears. He was well trained and tough, and, rather unusually for a member of the parachute regiment, he was German. His parents were Jewish. He and his parents had fled to England from the Nazi persecution in the 1930s, and eventually the son Peter found himself in the British Army. Like most of the men jumping on D-Day, he had no combat experience. Of all the units dropping from the sky that night, only the American 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment had already been at war as a unit.
After securing Ranville by 4 a.m. on D-Day, the paratroops and glider-borne men of the 6th Airborne Division dug in and fought to stabilise their fragile bridgehead to the east of the Orne River. After almost 2 weeks of hard fighting against German panzer divisions, on June the 19th, No. 7 Platoon were detailed to attack and destroy a troublesome gun.
After mortar preparation, they advanced, only to run into heavy machine gun fire, were pinned down and forced to withdraw. During this engagement, 1 officer and 14 other ranks were wounded and 2 other ranks missing. One of the missing other ranks was the German-born Jew Peter Claude Denby Dreyfus. He and Private Stanyan had both been killed in the attack by the machine gun fire. Their bodies, lying in no man's land, could not be recovered for many days. The young German-Jewish paratrooper, together with his English teammate, died attempting to destroy a dangerous enemy armoured fighting vehicle that was normally impervious to the attentions of lightly armed infantry. How does one pay tribute to men such as these?
Just as we were about to take our leave, I got a message from a cheap friend of mine, who was on his way to Ranville to pick us up and take us to dinner. He asked me to look up the grave of a certain Captain Robert de la Tour of the Pathfinders Regiment. We found Robert's headstone in this historic cemetery.
The fighting here was tough, personal, confused, and very, very vicious.
Joining us for dinner would be Robert's nephew, Simon de la Tour, and an eminent war correspondent and journalist, Christopher Long. Intrigued by the invitation, our jeep and driver took us across country to meet at Christopher's house deep in the Normandy countryside. Simon's uncle Robert had been one of the Pathfinders on D-Day, jumping in before the main force to set up lights and radio beacons as guidance to the drop zones for the Canadian and British paratroopers following shortly behind them. 27-year-old Canadian-born Captain Robert de la Tour, far left, with his Pathfinder comrades, was photographed synchronizing their watches on June the 5th before taking off from RAF Harwell to land close to Pegasus Bridge. It became one of the most recognized images of the war. So iconic was this image that it was chosen to be one of a series of postage stamps commemorating this anniversary.
Joined the Grenadier Guards as well, and then volunteered for special operations. He was part of the 22nd Independent Company, which were the Pathfinders. They left before the main assault. Their mission was to drop in various sections of a particular area and identify landing zones and drop zones. We were only all about 19, 20, 21-year-olds, and I think they kind of looked up to him. The officer would have been the first out, the first 4 to land in France.
Their Pathfinder lights and equipment were lost or broken during the drop. In the darkness, they joined up with Otway's team and assaulted the heavily defended German gun battery at Merville.
It was done quite quickly.
Later they returned to positions near Ranville to help other beleaguered comrades hold their ground.
And in a particular operation, which was I think about 2 weeks after the actual D-Day, he was leading his small troop, and he was killed in that particular action.
The paratroopers took and held their ground, but Bobby died of his wounds on the 20th of June.
It was a major tragedy. It must have happened to so many families.
We still had an appointment to keep with a certain aircraft and flight crew we had met a while ago in Tampa, Florida. But first we had to drive 60 miles across the Normandy battlefield to the American section and meet some of her passengers. People like the Round Canopy Parachute Team, Liberty Jumpers, and others from around the world whose passion is reenacting wartime parachute drops. First stop was Écosseville, near Cherbourg. There are going to be several commemorative jumps over the next few days, so these guys need to stay sharp, especially when jumping out of an 80-year-old aircraft with nothing but string and silk to help them. And training is important.
Especially on this occasion.
Even if it is in an old Zeppelin hangar. Steve Ellis George and Mark Gannard talk us through what it's like to do this, and why people like them risk life, limb and wallet to pursue this pastime.
stuff. Now I don't want to just put airborne stuff on, I want to actually do it. So I went off and did my round canopy qualifications, did my 5 jumps. I did the C-47 jumps, and there's nothing like it. You know, this is the sight and the sound of what was going on. So this is what we're trying to do. Putting the kit on and using the kit as it was supposed to be.
I think what makes the difference is the history. If you talk to any of the blokes that are into this, they know the history, and the history means a lot to them. It's not about the thrill of jumping, it's about what it means when you jump, that you're commemorating events, the events that happened here.
The venerable C-47s we met in Florida, and many others from the USA, had made it across the Atlantic Ocean and were now engaged in reenacted parachute drops into the same landing zones that the airborne troops were given 75 years ago. Doug and Popeye of That's All Brother told us a little about their Atlantic crossing as we met up with them and other C-47s in Cherbourg and at Carpiquet Airport.
Did mainly a loose formation, Vic, diamond pattern, echelon, etc. So we were always within, 1,000 yards of each other. This airplane came out of restoration in February of last year and has been on the road ever since. This is Doug Rosendahl.
Wooden head, wooden shoes, wouldn't listen. We follow the same route in the same airplanes that they did 75 years ago. It in no way, shape, or form represents what they did. We had over 50,000 hours of flight experience in the cockpit. Satellite weather pictures. We had 8 GPSs. We had text messaging via Iridium satellite for instant weather reports at any time. There was ice out there, but we never, we flew where it wasn't. It was an incredibly simple, straightforward trip. We had no issue.
I asked Doug what sort of problems would the original guys have faced, and how old were they?
Weather, mechanical issues, navigation errors, and just a general lack of experience. In no way, shape, or form did what we do simulate or expose ourselves to the risks that they did. 20 to 25 years old. I'm sure many of them didn't have a combined total of 500 hours of flight experience. So, no, we're paying a lot of our own expenses. I didn't even total up what this is going to cost. It doesn't matter. I'm going to do it. And I will go home with a redoubled passion to fight to maintain the aviation freedom that we have in America.
We'll keep his spare clothes, rations, ammunition, anything that he needed to carry in there for what was only going to be temporary 2 or 3 days in action.
The airborne reenactors checked and rechecked their equipment, some with their own quiet thoughts, some dwelling on the historical relevance of this jump, and the C-47 crews went through their startup procedures. They were getting ready to recreate part of the largest air and seaborne invasion ever mounted.